sovereignty of its neighbors. And who aims at undermining democracies and also our international institutions, such as the ones we are discussing here, the European Union and NATO, through disinformation operations. We will also dig into that in this time. And security challenges also stems from within, such a rising support for populist and anti-democratic policies, as well as uncertainties regarding the role of the UK in European security after Brexit, and the even broader perspective of the strength of the transatlantic link in light of growing divergences on a range of political issues. Internal challenges in most global Western countries, an increasing gap between the population, which creates internal disturbance that others can fish in. So, how is the worsened security situation in Northern Europe relevant for the development of European defense? How should the transatlantic link develop in light of the deepened European defense cooperation, or is it deepened? How will European defence cooperation with the UK look like post-Brexit? This is the questions we are getting answers on in this panel. I have a great panel with me. I'm not using much time to introduce them because you can read about them in our program. It's really a pleasure for me to welcome Dr. Andrew Michta, who's Dean at the George Marshall European Centre for Security Studies in Garmisch. The second speaker, who we have heard earlier today, is Professor Julian Lindley-French, Senior Fellow at the Institute for Statecraft in London, and a frequent blogger. The third panelist is coming from Riga, Dr. Māris Andžāns, I'm not good at this, who is a Senior Research Fellow at the Latvian Institute of International Affairs. And finally, our fourth panelist is Dr. Taija Tiilikainen, who is Director at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs in Helsinki. So, enough from me. Andrew, please.
Okay. Thank you very much, Kate. And thank you, Anna. And thank you, Alina, for inviting me here. As I already indicated, I am speaking here in my private capacity and not, my views should be taken only as private views. I'm not representing the policy or position of the U.S. government, U.S. Defense Department, the German Ministry of Defense, in any formal way. So having said that, I'm also very impressed that the rate of combat attrition has been relatively low. I was worried that there would be too many people here. Thank you for coming to this discussion. As I indicated earlier, I had a very kind of well-developed speech that I had prepared here, and Katie told us to speak for maybe 5-10 minutes max to allow for maximum discussion, but I kind of reoriented and rearranged some of it because it seems to me that we got so deeply into the weeds of what the European defense, various initiatives and visions and concepts were, that it seems to me we left behind a couple of very fundamental strategic questions. So the first one is that I would argue, especially if you look at our national security strategy that was published in 2017, and then National Defense Strategy of the United States. It's a classified document, but there's an unclassified summary of about 12 pages that Secretary Māris released in January of 2018 at SAIS Johns Hopkins. Then you will probably appreciate that, at least as far as the United States is concerned, we are in a different era from that what we had experienced between the end of the Cold War and the arrival of the new administration. We are in a period of what I would call resurgent state-on-state competition. And both documents identify, they're strategic documents. Usually some of those documents were more statements of intent, but these are really strategic documents. They've identified both China and the resurgent Russia as the two principal peer competitors of the United States. One intent on displacing the U.S. from the center of the international system, and the other one, a revisionist power that wants to reclaim what I would call a sphere of privileged interest along its periphery, and is also operating at different levels globally. And I would also submit to you that this is the environment most likely everybody in this room will live in for the rest of our lives, because the changes are truly fundamental. They've built over decades, and we can get into this discussion how we got there, but we're looking at challenges of getting our supply chain back from Asia into the United States, especially that one that's absolutely fundamental to our security. And most of all, we're looking at the need of not to create quote-unquote autonomy on either part, but actually at strengthening the transatlantic link. Full disclosure, I am a committed NATO guy. I'm a NATO booster. I believe there is no organization out there that can provide the kind of value when it comes to both US and European defense that NATO can provide. If you just look at even the nominal requirements, about 2% of GDP within the alliance that 3 summits have kind of put on the table, if you take into account any real attempt to build a deterrent system in Europe sufficient to suppress security competition, resources needed to project power, to defend the larger European space, you're looking at orders of magnitude that each individual member country would have to expand. And most of all, doing this in a structure where you are still fundamentally, no matter what you call the European Union, you're still fundamentally a treaty-based organization of sovereign states that have decided to pull some of the aspects of their sovereignty for a variety of ways, for a variety of reasons, but which in the end cannot function, I would argue, in the military sphere, simply cannot function in the military sphere the same way as a nation state is capable of functioning, or as an alliance that is created for strictly defined defensive objectives can operate. Second point I want to make, so let me say from the very beginning, I'm a great supporter of everything Europe can do to strengthen its capabilities in its defense, 100%. Provided this is done not at the expense of the NATO alliance and our common capabilities. Because I simply do not see a configuration, an arrangement where extended deterrence without American involvement and direct participation could be provided in Europe and on the Eurasian periphery. Second point, I think what needs to be also communicated, and the previous panel I think very rightly stated that we have some work to do in terms of communicating to our respective public opinions about how the world has changed. Let me start with China. The Chinese have gone through about 5 decades now of accumulating surpluses, transferring technological property. Actually, there's a study that was just done by the US Congress that 1 out of 5 of Western companies doing business in China has been extorted for intellectual property in exchange for market access. China has brought its qualitative edge when it comes to weapon systems that much closer to our capabilities, in large part because, unlike during the Cold War when the Russians had to reverse engineer using their own technological chain the weapon systems that they acquired or believed they had to build based on what we produced, we have farmed out essentially jewels of our technological culture to Asia. I'm not an engineer, but people who work on these issues tell me that your technological excellence is in alloys, processes, it's how you do stuff, not so much in how you design it and how you operate it. And if you get to a point where some of the key systems in your defense infrastructure require inputs from that supply chain, which is no longer in your own control, but it's controlled by people who are becoming your peer competitor, you're in a very tough spot. I live in Germany, and I take great pride in the fact that the Germans remain a very vibrant exporting economy, and Germany, to a large extent, continues to sell, quote-unquote, iron, cars, machine tools, other things of that kind. I will remind you that when I was getting into this business, we were being told by our experts that we're a post-industrial society, this was a knowledge-based economy, and those things simply didn't matter. See where we got with that kind of attitude today. It's not too late in my view. I believe what's happening right now in our attempt to even the playing field with the Chinese is the attempt to reverse those trends and create a more equitable situation. Free ride is over, and I think there's a consensus among the American business community, even those guys who are very comfortable with the current setup, that this has to change. The second point that I want to make is that if you look at the progression that China has made, that is now, China is now what I would call increasingly a global power. It's a global player. We had this conversation when Barbara was saying that the American focus will be in Asia, therefore it will be de-emphasized here in Europe. The Chinese are in Colombia, they're in South America, they're in the United States, they're in Mexico, they're all over Europe. The Chinese are a European power in many ways as well when it comes to the projection of their economic strength and their political influence. So the fundamental point I want to make, and that's why I keep saying we need to work together. I know it sounds like a Boy Scout, but there's a saying, we either hang together or we're going to hang separately. I want to talk about Western defense, or the defense of developed, consolidated democracies, kind of thinking strategically going forward and understanding what we need to do. Second point, Russia. The Russians are a revisionist state. They're at the tail end of about a 10-year military modernization program. By our estimates, about 700 billion roughly, so you could say small potatoes compared to what we're spending on defense. This is less than this year's budgetary account that we have for Ireland. But remember that this is done in the context where Europe has pretty much demilitarized over the past 2 decades. And the Europeans are now, because of that, the Russian relatively small investment, both in new platforms, in missile systems, new tank platforms, armored personnel vehicles, drone technology, submarine unmanned systems, and things like that. The Russians have been able to shift dramatically the balance on the eastern flank. And they also did this by going full spectrum of statecraft, including the application of military power, as you've seen, especially in Ukraine. Ukraine is being strangled right now, if you look at the latest crisis. And the outcome in Ukraine, I think, will say a lot about what we will see in Europe. Putin, in my view, is intent not only on restoring Russian influence on the flank, and this impacts directly on the Scandinavian countries. If you don't believe me, ask yourself why the Russians were so aggressively jamming the GPS signal off the coast of Norway during the last Trident juncture. It's not even about the Baltic so much as it is about the North Atlantic. Because the A280 that reaches into the North Atlantic from the Russian side would make it very hard for us to bring forces back into Europe. I came to the Marshall Center from the Naval War College. I remember when Admiral Richardson was just appointed the new Chief of Naval Operations, and an open forum came in and said, NATO needs a new maritime strategy. What we have in place is inadequate. It's absolutely essential that we start thinking in terms of not just whether we can break through decisively Russian A280 capabilities around the Baltic, but also whether or not we can keep the North Atlantic open. And I think our European allies and partners can do a great deal to support our common effort. Putin also wants to dismantle the existing security institutions in Europe. And here the problem is totally EU-based. The Russians want to deal on the bilateral basis with the largest players in Europe. The Russians do not want to interact with NATO as an alliance or the European Union as an organization, because then the balance of power is obvious outside of the nuclear deterrent. Outside of nuclear power, then Russia is maybe 1/8, 1/10 of the potential that the European and transatlantic forces can bring to bear. And what worries me the most is that the amount of discord, especially in light of the kind of aftershocks of the invasion of Ukraine, the seizure of Crimea, the overturning of the European rules-based system, that is generating what I would call an uneven response from across Europe. Some countries are stepping up, and again, I agree. Nations live in neighborhoods. If you live in Norway, Sweden, Finland, Poland, Baltic states, you feel immediately threatened because this is the neighborhood in which you live. My country is a global power, so we have a global neighborhood, we have a global perspective on this. But what's insidious about the current situation is that Europe is buffeted by so many pressures right now, beginning with the aftershocks of the 2008 economic crisis, what has occurred due to the immigration wave into Europe. I came on my second tour in Germany in 2016 at the tail end of immigration into Germany. So I watched it firsthand, about 2 million people going through Germany, roughly 1 million staying, and the impact on the politics of Europe that this wave has had. The single largest wave of immigration since the end of the Second World War, coming almost exclusively from outside of Europe. You don't have to look at Germany, you can look at Italy, you can look at your own country here in Sweden, how your political center is beginning to shrink, and the extreme politics on the left and on the right are beginning to surface. The Russians are exploiting this very effectively, and I think the ability to navigate across the continent and having a strong type of the United States is critical. GDP will drop from about 33% to about 10, 11%. Countries that are not in Eurozone, by definition, will find themselves in a peripheral position, just in strictly economic terms. And especially if the project of the two-tier Europe will proceed going forward, this will bring further bifurcation of the European Union, not just in economic terms, but also in systemic terms. What makes matters even more complicated, everything I know about alliance, about organizational theory, is that if you start dividing up an organization, you end up with two or none. So if you start talking about a multi-tier Europe, two-tier Europe, the irony is that on security issues, countries that find themselves in the Eurozone may actually cluster with other flank countries that are not in the Eurozone. So the Balts will look to Poland on security issues, but they will look to Germany on economic issues. The fluctuation you're going to have in the European Union as a result of that serves Putin very well. Let me wrap up with a couple of observations and a plea. I would call on everyone who talks about European defense to think of it as a defense of the transatlantic community rather than strategic autonomy or things that we can do other than, of course, the overarching kind of security blanket that the United States is providing to the alliance. We're not disengaging from Europe. Don't confuse the noise for the signal. You hear politicians sometimes say things, you hear in this daily 24 news cycle things that are being said. Watch what we do. The United States is increasing its deployments in Europe. We're trying to work with our allies to firm up their defenses. We're working on air and missile defense systems that will provide what we need here on the flank. We want to ensure that security competition in Europe remains suppressed. We're not doing this because we like who we do. We're doing this because it's in our interest. Being forced into a competitive relationship with the Chinese anywhere along the globe, even in Asia, has to rely on the conviction that here with our European allies, we may prevent the worst from happening, that deterrence will hold in Europe in this fight. This is in your interest, I would argue, and this is in our interest. Which means, very practically speaking, European defense, logistics, logistics, logistics. Europe, because it has moved away from the peace dividend era into an era of very low defense spending, has also dismantled most of the infrastructure that was essential during the Cold War that allowed the United States and its allies to exercise. We need access to rail. We need bridges that would hold a fully loaded trailer with a tank on it. Tanks got bigger. The bridges have been degraded. We need access to refueling capabilities. We need legal norms that allow us to move our equipment and our troops back and forth. If the defense of the northeastern flank is to be credible, we need to exercise it. We need to be able to do this in a way that sends an unequivocal message to the Russian side that in the event of an all-out crisis, we're capable of doing it. Unexercised military capabilities are vaporware. We have laid down the markets, we've put the wires, now we have battalions in the Baltic states. We're working closely now with our Finnish and our Swedish friends. And also, of course, we have a brigade combat team in Poland. We're talking about what should be done next to increase deterrence on the flank. But I keep coming back, if we don't have the logistical piece, if it takes us 2 weeks to move troops across the territory to the flank, then we're in a very, very tough spot. So one thing that I would argue, if we want to talk about how Europe can firm up defense, I would look at the logistical piece of the spectrum. And I will stop at this and hand it over to Julian.
Okay, thank you. I would just ask you a question before.
Yes.
I think that you say that the US will stay in Europe. NATO is the most important security alliance. But how can, and the Europeans have to do more. How can we find the best divisional labor between a European Union that wants to step up and a NATO that will have to take care of our collective?
Excellent question, Kate. What I would say is make sure that your capabilities are deployed. An Air Force that can fly in circles over your capital is a fight club. It's not an Air Force from the point of view of NATO needs. The Europeans can do a great deal by making their national forces deployable, interoperable, and able to add to the specific missions that are in the NATO problem set. we need to get away, in my view, from the conversation about what's duplicating, what's not duplicating. I will repeat, I am in favor of anything that strengthens European defense capabilities, provided those capabilities can be used within the NATO structure and contribute to the NATO mission. Because in the final analysis, European security and my own country's security depends on this transatlantic link. It brought Europe the longest period of peace, pure and simple, and it brought us unprecedented prosperity. Europe has never been this wealthy in its history. Think of Europe at the end of the Second World War, when it was on its back. The European Union project would not have been possible, in my view, without the NATO umbrella. Just the very basic Franco-German reconciliation. Look at the Polish-German reconciliation that is taking place. All these things were done because of the transatlantic link. So my plea would be invest, undo the damage that was done in the military capabilities sphere. If you look at the US national security strategy, we're actually setting a target of how much of the defense spending, in our view, in Europe, in NATO, should go for usable military capabilities by 2023. Thank you.
Okay, back in 2012, when the European Union got the Nobel Peace Prize, I said the Norwegian television should have been shared with NATO. Because they were part of the bomb. Got a lot of comments on that one. Please, Julian, could you expand on how will European defence cooperation look like without Britain, without the UK?
Thank you, Kate, and thank you. Normally I would give you a very dramatic, big picture expose and identify policy lacunae, but I'm convinced that this moment is so serious, so big, that I'm going to try something unusual for me, to be very serious and somewhat boring. This session is entitled Internal and External Challenges for Northern European Security. And there are three specific important questions that Kate has asked us to address. How is the deteriorating security situation in Northern Europe relevant to the future development of European defence? How should the transatlantic link develop in light of deepened European defence cooperation? And how will European defence cooperation with the UK look post-Brexit? I'll answer that bluntly at the end. But my core message is this: be it Arctic resources, the Northern Sea Passage, China's interest in the region with the Arctic Road Initiative, or Russia's determination to defend its nuclear bastions and its access to the North Atlantic with extended A2AD, as Andrew eloquently described, Northern Europe will be for the first time full of front-line states. You are on the front line just as much as the East and the South, and I do believe that politicians in this area need to get their head around that reality. I do believe that your allegiances will become more important, not less. The question then becomes the one that emerged from this morning's discussion. Will they be any good, and will they serve the public good that you require of them to ensure that security and defence is maintained? The first question is, how is a deteriorating security situation in Northern Europe relevant to the future development of European defence? Well, let me start with a relevant fact. Of 116 major cyber attacks identified by the CrowdStrike Foundation, which are cyber security specialists, in the first half of 2018, the Chinese and Russian state together were responsible for well over 60% of those attacks, with over 35% of such attacks targeted on technology firms included in this region. All open democratic societies face what I call in my forthcoming book, which John Allen and Ben Hodges, which is brilliant and very reasonably priced, no plug, called Future War and the Defence of Europe. 5D warfare by the strategic autocracies is now upon us. Disinformation, destabilization, disruption, destruction and deception are and will be applied across a new spectrum of escalation, from hybrid war to cyber war to possible high-end hyper war. The method of such war is one that we're already seeing. It takes place at the margins of our alliance and our union, and at the seams within our increasingly diverse society. The aim is clear: to coerce policymakers and to humiliate and thus undermine NATO and the EU in the eyes of its citizens, and thus foster more instability. Consequently, there are no distinct flanks in Europe anymore, just places and peoples to be manipulated and undermined and exploited. The strongest defence will be strategic solidarity, political cohesion, hardened systems, and more robust and resilient peoples as part of a new partnership between the state and the citizen. There can be no effective defence without the home base much more effectively protected against such incursions. Whilst Northern Europe is indeed on the front line of such attacks, the states herein are sufficiently cohesive with the appropriate historical experience of galvanising society in defence to lead by example in striking a new balance between people protection and the projection of deterrence and defence. The projection of deterrence and defence. There can be no such thing as a static defence or static deterrence in the 21st century. Second question: how should the transatlantic link develop in light of deepened European defence cooperation? Well, I'm tempted to say, what deepened European defence cooperation? But I'll put that to one side. My relevant fact for this question is this. According to General Mark Milley, the newly appointed chairman of the US Joint Chiefs, during his testimony to the Senate Appropriations Subcommittee on Defence, if one strips out the relatively high cost of US labour, the combined defence outcomes China and Russia generate are dangerously close to that of the United States and far beyond any defence outcomes that we Europeans aspire to. General Milley went on, and I quote, "I have seen comparative numbers of US defence budget versus China, US defence budget versus Russia. What is not often commented on is the cost of labour. We're the best paid military in the world by a long shot. The cost of Russian soldiers or Chinese soldiers is a tiny fraction." So what does that mean? In other words, whilst US forces are, as Churchill once said, overpaid over here and unadapted, overstretched, it is that problem of overstretch which is the essential condition that we Europeans must heed if we are not to undermine our own security and defence guarantee. The message from General Milley, to my mind, is clear. If the US defence guarantee to Europeans is to be maintained, given the global reach US forces must maintain in the face of an aggressive Russia and a strategically insurgent China, not to mention the regionally strategic challenge posed by a complex Middle East and North Africa, Europeans are going to have to become far more militarily capable and able, in the worst case, to act as effective first responders. My worst nightmare is a major crisis in Asia Pacific, a manufactured crisis in the Middle East, and an opportunistic crisis in Europe, when the Americans are simply too overstretched to be in strength in all places at the same time. Wake up and smell the coffee, people, because that is the new strategic equation of European defence. 20 years on from St. Malo, and I worked on St. Malo 20 years ago, neither PESCO nor the European Defence Fund, or E2I, whatever you want to call it, suggest the EU, in terms of defence strategic ambition, envisages a European defence capability that will transform the European pillar of the transatlantic relationship. And make no mistake, EU defence ambitions only make sense if they can transform, in terms of efficiency and effectiveness, the European pillar of the transatlantic relationship. Only by capability will Europeans generate strategic autonomy, and strategic autonomy should reinforce transatlantic solidarity, not undermine it. Creating ever more acronyms without ever more forces will not solve Europe's growing defence gap. There is every chance that the transatlantic link is to become more transactional and more conditional, with coalitions of the strategically willing and really capable the future, unless institutional European defence, NATO or the EU, finally gets its act together. And that is a combination of Andrew's logistics, General Bradley famously said that, but almost capabilities. We cannot build capabilities and ambition on words. We must have forces and resources that can bring to the table something meaningful in the worst case. When I first began in this game, many years ago, and took part in exercises in the 80s, we always addressed worst case scenarios with ministers playing their own role in an emergency. We Europeans have got to reinstate the culture of worst case scenario analysis and planning. On that front, it is interesting that the British are now talking about a Five Eyes satellite positioning system. Now London has been effectively expelled from the sharp end of Galileo, which, given the money, the technology, and the know-how that we invested, strikes me as complete and utter nonsense. By the way, it's not the first nonsense I've heard. I sat in a meeting in Brussels with the European Commission about a year and a half ago, and a senior official seriously said that in the event of a no-deal Brexit, Britain would be expelled from intelligence sharing. To which my response was, so where are you going to get it to? I mean, this is complete and utter legalistic, balmy nonsense. Sorry, but we, call it what it is. The danger is that power will simply step outside of institutional frameworks. That groupings like Five Eyes will become the true organisers of defence. Do you really think the Americans, in a real emergency, would first turn to NATO for a meeting to discuss possible options? No. They would lead a coalition to deal with that emergency. Why? Because we haven't modernised our institutions to cope with the new reality. Which brings me, in conclusion, Kate, to how will European defence cooperation with the UK look post-Brexit? Well, my relevant fact for this is that post-Brexit, some 80% of European defence capacity, as Andrew alluded to, will be outside the EU. The UK already presents 25% of European defence capacity. 88% of all European R&T is Britain, France and Germany, with 57% Britain and France together. So the answer to that question depends on the degree of turbulence over the next few years. And by the way, Brexit will take years to resolve. Do not think for a moment that Britain's contribution to the defence of Europe, even though Britain is going nowhere, can be divorced from what is happening over Brexit today. And let me be absolutely blunt. The deal on the table will not stand. I'm a Remainer, I campaign for Remain. I will do everything in my power to destroy this deal. And millions of Britons will do the same thing. And if you want a very angry Britain on the margins of European defence, we are heading in that direction. And my plea is we must not go there. I am absolutely committed to Britain's engagement in this region. I've been an absolute strong supporter of the GEF. And I fully acknowledge and support Britain's engagement in Northern Europe. But let me say this, even though Britain clearly is not going anywhere, as a top 5 world power, economic and military, you should look at the strategic choices, the defence strategic choices, the British are already making, more than the words, the soothing words that are coming from London. All the major defence investments are in areas where the British can rely upon US systems and plug into defence industrial capability. Maritime amphibious power projection built around new US marine-friendly Queen Elizabeth class heavy aircraft carriers. US data-linked F-35 Lightning II air assets, new Astute-class nuclear power attack submarines that relieve the pressure on the United States Navy, and the currently being built new Dreadnought-class ballistic missile submarines. In an emergency, the British Army is meant to generate 2 divisions for the continental defence of Europe. In fact, the British Army is as small as at any time since the Napoleonic Wars, and would find it hard to generate even 1 division. If I was being really cynical, and this is why this moment is so sensitive, so vulnerable, and why Brexit cannot be separated from Britain's engagement in the defence of Europe, my final message would be this. Britain is a nuclear-armed island with a powerful power projection military. If Europe's margins, far away from Britain, fell to an attack, of course, London would see it as highly regrettable. But if public opinion had become so toxic in the UK about Britain's engagement in the defence of that war, Britain would probably say to itself, we will survive. We must not go there. We must find a deal. We must maintain European solidarity somehow through this tactical mess, given the bigger picture into which we're all moving together, and we must modernise the transatlantic relationship so that it copes with the pressures that Andrew very eloquently described. Okay.
Thank you very much, Julian. One question for you as well. Yeah. What do you think the Nordics, and there I include the Baltic countries, what can they do to improve UK's role in European security in these turbulent days and weeks?
Well, the single most important thing that can be done is happening right now. We have somehow, the choice is very clear. We can have a legalistic commitment by the Union to the Irish backstop deal. The price you will pay is the strategic partnership with the United Kingdom. You will, over time. Or, we can come to a new pragmatic mechanism which will enable the United Kingdom to maintain, not to be humiliated by this, and currently we are in the process not only to be humiliated, but frankly defeated, which the British people simply will not accept. Find a mechanism that maintains the relationships without destroying the situation in Ireland. As an aside, I have to say, I lived in the Canton de Vaud in Switzerland for many years, when Switzerland wasn't in Schengen. We had about 20 border crossings around where I lived in Europe. There was one formal border crossing, and there was about 19 other borders which were never manned. Every now and then a douanier would turn up, but it was informal, it worked. No one asked questions, it was just an informal mechanism to link the entire withdrawal agreement on this particular border issue. And I've been in Northern Ireland. I spent time in there in the 80s. I know all about Northern Ireland. Strikes me as a legalistic nonsense. We must find a strategic solution.
We have to find a solution. Not I, because I'm not a member of the European Union, but the 2 other speakers will have to look into that. Māris, how does this look from Riga?
Well, yes, thank you very much. Thanks for this discussion opportunity to speak here. So how things look around Riga. I will try to elaborate in the Baltic states, quite often, some of us do not like, that we are put in the same basket, but nevertheless we are. Security is so much interlinked, and then we can speak basically as one of the Baltic states. So it's quite often referred, elsewhere and also here that the security situation has deteriorated. In the Baltic Sea region, in Baltics, but I would argue on the contrary. At least Baltic states, we are more secure than ever. And the Ukrainian crisis, paradoxically, it has been, so to say, a perfect occasion for us. In many respects, if we look at Russia, Russia is the same as it was 10 or 5 years ago. Of course, it has gone stronger, more sort of say, agile, capable, and acting.
Excuse me, please hold the mic a bit closer.
Okay, so speak closer.
That's right.
It's switched off. Yes. So, what I told that the Baltic states, we are safer than ever before. Because Russia was the same as it is currently, and if you remember some decade ago or something, so the Balts always were, telling that Russia poses significant threats not only to the Baltic states but also others. And then usually here in Scandinavia and elsewhere, we were told, calm down, desecuritize Russia. There is, nothing to be feared about. Russia is on the road of democratization, westernization, so on and on. But we told that no, this is not going to happen. And thank God that things have changed since then. And here we have to pay respect and again thank you many respects to Ukraine. Because before Ukraine, which was absolutely a wake-up call, not only for Latvia and Baltics at large, but also many other countries. So at least Latvia completely neglected its defense, but was absolutely incapable. It was we were spending less than 1% of GDP for defense, and there was also almost nothing of the Allied presence. We had this air patrolling mission, air policing. We had some exercises, but now indeed we are safer than ever. We have Allied boots on the ground. So we have the enhanced force presence, led by Canada and Latvia, by the UK and Estonia, and surprisingly by Germany and Lithuania. So what a change! And we also have rotating American presence. So American soldiers are rotating throughout the Baltic states, which is something, it was taboo before Ukraine. So it was unimaginable before. So therefore, indeed, the security situation has not deteriorated. It is much better in these respects. When it comes to the Baltic states and the threats, of course, usually when we are asked to rank the threats to, for example, Latvia, so 1, 2, 3. So 1 is Russia, 2 is Russia, and 3 is Russia, of course. But it's not only about the military sector, of course. Who else could pose a threat? So maybe Belarus in some kind of combination with Russia, but not alone in any way. And but Russia, it's not only about the military sector, it's also about the societal cohesion. So you know that as a result of the Soviet occupation, the society, especially in Latvia and Estonia, is quite fragmented. The Russian media, the presence of them is pervasive in Baltic states. So if you take statistics, so some 80% of non-ethnic Latvians, they acquire information in Russian language. Among the 12 most trusted media are those of the Russian state, so 1/2 of the media. So you can imagine where significant portions of people acquire information on what's going on. And if you take a look at some TV shows or news in Russia, so it's quite awful. It's quite appalling, at least from our perspective, how things are treated with Ukraine, with America, with the European Union, and with many other things. And it's also about cyberspace and somewhat still about the energy and cargo transit sectors. We have progressed significantly since years. So a few years ago, we were still an energy island in the European Union because we were still quite much integrated in the post-Soviet electricity and natural gas market. So now things are much better. We are still, so to say, like peninsula, but not anymore electricity island. We have, for example, the interconnection to Sweden from Lithuania and to connections from Estonia to Finland. And then also things are evolving further. About the Baltic states, and of course many things we have to do ourselves. So all 3 Baltic states are spending 2% of GDP, but again, this was not the gift of the God or anybody else. This was basically because of Ukraine, because we also thought that it's a to use the terminology of Hegel or Fukuyama, end of history. It was that things are fine, and we can also laid down. But again, even though, as also State Secretary of the Latvian Ministry of Defense told that we are doing much more, but we should not be naive about our capabilities. We will not be able to defend ourselves against Russia. Again, we can speak about hours, days, but we have no air forces. Currently, we have 4 Mi-17 helicopters which are just mostly for transportation and search and rescue purposes, and there are many issues which will not be possible to resolve them, and we need, of course, the Allied assistance, and above all, we need the American presence. When we say NATO, we think the America. It's not about the rest, unfortunately. And what we would need definitely is permanent American presence. So you have probably heard about the forthcoming proposal for Poland, so it's probably much more unrealistic for the Baltic states, but that would be a perfect occasion if we had American presence, permanent presence. When it comes to, Americans are departing or not, despite many concerns and expressions, Americans are increasing their presence in the Baltics. So they are assisting with financial resources, with equipment. As mentioned, they're also rotating soldiers in Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania. They have supported the renovation of infrastructure, so they are there. And on 18th of November, we celebrated the centenary of Latvia. You can see also the logo of the centenary of Latvia here above us. And Americans sent a quite good signal. For the first time, an American Patriot missile system was shown in military parade alongside other hardware that we have and other allies have. So it's above all about the American presence. And despite, as I mentioned, despite changes in the U.S., things are not that bad in practice, luckily enough. But then on the European side, on the European Common Security Defense Policy, and this has been always seen with quite a degree of suspicion, because to be again blunt, as Professor also blunt, France and Germany, they are not seen as the most trustable and reliable partners when it comes to defense. We still, remember security history, some decades ago, and also, for example, 2003, when the new Atlanticists, supported America with Iraq, and then Jacques Chirac said that you should have used this opportunity to keep silent. That you shouldn't have done this. Of course, we remember Johann Schneider, where he has found his, so to say, new code, and then also Nord Stream is not, so to say, helpful in many respects, and that's why, of course, there are suspicions about Germany and France. But what is very helpful is that Germany is leading the Enhanced Force Presence battle group in Lithuania, French, also assisting Estonia, so this is very important, and things are changing. And the last point is that, of course, we should ask also ourselves. We have to be self-critical. That it's not that everybody else has to help us. We should do also something as well. And then we have to ask. So what we have done, for Germany or France, so that they also reciprocated. And then, of course, it is clear that we have to do more, and we should engage more with missions in Africa, in the Middle East, elsewhere. We have to support also, let's say, their vision. And one thing that I would also like to mention is that I think also the Latvian and other authorities should be, so to say, more cautious about European defense and security policy in the way that they should treat the situation as not putting all eggs in one basket. Because again, Americans are here, but who knows how future will evolve, and we cannot, so to say, base our expectations on one thing, and therefore we should do more on the European defense, so to say, not to try expel Americans in whatever way, but also have to try to please the Germans and French if they do so, if that is beneficial to our security. So I will stop here and looking forward to the questions.
Thank you very much, Māris. I will ask you also one question before we proceed. When you say that NATO, when you say NATO, you mean the US. closer bilateral relationship between the US and some or different European allies, particularly in Northern Europe, can affect, you know, the cohesion and the solidarity in NATO and also in the NATO, EU or European members? Or is it supplementary?
It should be supplementary, but unfortunately it is not on quite so many occasions, because there are different perspectives, as was mentioned before. For France, they have different geographical areas. Germany is incapable and willing in many respects. So what should we do then in such cases? So who is able to assist us? Then there is only one, let's say, natural, capable, and hopefully willing partner. But at the same time, of course, we understand that we are located in Europe. Russia will not disappear, you know, from where it stands. And then, of course, that is quite a significant issue, which we should avoid to bridge the gaps between both camps.
Okay, thank you. Coming to the next speaker, Tea. Finland has a 1,300 kilometers long border with Russia. And you know certainly that Russia will not disappear, as the former speaker said. So I would like to hear how you are thinking about what's happening in the European security policy at the moment. And I ask you all to prepare questions, because I'm not going to ask more questions after the last speaker is finished, because we just have 40 minutes, 30 minutes before we
Thank you so much, Madam Chairperson. I'll try to limit my presentation to 7 minutes. And I speak from the Finnish point of view. And as the Swedish audience well remembers, Finland joined the European Union because of security political reasons. I'm not talking about defense, not about hard security, but security in a broader manner. Societal security, security of our political system, security of our borders, our territory, and our citizens. And this goal has only been strengthened during our 2 decades as a member country of the European Union. So I think this is the overall policy line of Finland still today. I can very much share the view given by previous speakers what comes to the worsening security political environment. That corresponds to the Finnish understanding as well. But I still want to add one dimension that has not been mentioned this far. Something during these past 10 years, 15, has happened to European integration as well. So it's by far deepened, much more deepened economic and political union, but also a currency union with common external borders, with common political system, even with a citizenship. And this plays a role, we think, in Finland, what comes to the security political needs of the European Union. So the conclusion about its elections these days. It's countering the propaganda campaign, dealing with various EU issues. So this broader perspective to security and defense is a characteristic of Finland's policy and approach towards European security and defense. I will then describe the Finnish policy with 3 concepts. We can also see them as the Finnish expectations concerning European security and defense. And the concepts would be comprehensive, pragmatic, and territorial. And I will briefly give you the content of all of these 3. And comprehensive very much relates to what I already said about the very original expectations of Finland when it joined the European Union. We would be a part of a political and an economic community, nowadays also a member of the currency union, and this would create an interdependence which would be a security guarantee for us. So this interdependence, other member states being dependent on our security, that is the security guarantee, not the Article 42.7. 42.7 is important, and I will come back to that a bit later. But this is the way we see the security policy benefits of EU membership and European integration. So the Finnish point of view is that this interdependence is important. Still, we very much appreciate also hard security in the EU's context. Finnish policy line has always been that the EU should try to develop its own defense instruments and do this in cooperation with NATO. And of course, I can only speak about NATO as an outsider because Finland is not a member. The Finnish point of view as an outsider to NATO has always been, and this is very much accentuated now during these crisis years after Ukraine, that both NATO and EU are needed. They are both very essential for European security, and they have both tasks in this setup. So this constant disagreement about duplication, about overlapping tasks, this we see is useless because, as we said in the morning, NATO is based on the forces of its member states, and these are the same forces that the EU's defense is based upon. So the foundation is pretty much the same. And if we can strengthen this foundation, as we now try to do, by using the EU's mechanisms, that is also beneficial for NATO. That is beneficial for the very same member states of NATO, NATO's European allies. And so sometimes it's very difficult to see what this argument is all about. These two organizations should be able to complement each other and cooperate. And in this kind of an environment, there is all the reason for them to do so. So so Finland hopes that the US would stay in Europe, would stay committed to European defense, but still the EU would do what it has planned to do. And we clearly see that what has happened during the past two years in EU strengthens the capabilities of the European allies, and the EU's mechanisms are being used in this context. Comprehensive in the Finnish case also means that we are, irrespective of everything taking place in the EU's framework, we are also enhancing our bilateral defense cooperation with the US, with Sweden, as Minister Hultqvist said this morning. It's very important for us, but also in other multilateral fora such as NORDEFCO. Comprehensive has many meanings from the Finnish point of view. Territorial, and this is the difference when in comparison with what colleagues from France and Germany said this morning, because the Finnish expectations concerning European security and defense policy are concretely territorial. They are related to territorial defense as well. Territory also means borders, so it's not only that we would expect the strengthening of the EU's Article 5, 42.7, but it's also about border security, border management. You might remember the autumn of 2015, when for the first time after the war times, the Finnish-Russian border was opened by Russia for illegal migration. They came into Finland in thousands, and they were called a phenomenon of tourism by the Russian President Putin. It was a reminder to Finland about reminder of what hybrid threats or hybrid aggression might mean, what forms it might take. And it stopped when the problem was discussed at the political level. So territory also must be seen, and territorial security and defense in a broader sense from the Finnish point of view. But this also, from our point of view, means that we are very willing and prepared to discuss the further meaning of the EU's Article 42.7. We very much understand that it's a bilateral commitment between the EU's member states to defend each other in the case of military aggression against any of them, without any further EU-level competencies or machinery or preparedness. But in particular, after the first implementation of the mutual assistance clause, the Finnish view is that something could still be done to make the EU and its member states a little bit more prepared to take into use this treaty provision also in other types of circumstances. I will conclude with pragmatic. So I talked about comprehensive expectations and approach, also about territorial approach, and I conclude with pragmatic. Finland is, as all the other Nordic countries, I think, are very pragmatic. So Finland, from the Finnish point of view, it seems that there is a lot of unused potential in the EU when it comes to defending its member states' security and defense. Unused potential. It was also mentioned in the Franco-German panel here that conventional deterrence is not what France, in this case, I think France is ready to in the EU's case, but in Finland's case, we think that the EU should send a much stronger signal. Security and defense is very much about deterrence. It's about sending the signal that to possible adversaries that whatever they try, there is a unified front meeting the adversaries from the European Union. So this potential should also be taken into use in that way. Finland is frustrated with the disappointments coming from some unused potential, such as the EU's battle groups. In general, from the Finnish point of view, it seems that one could do much more. Even little steps would take the EU's security and defense approach much further than what has been achieved now. I think this was all, but I have to comment a little bit also on what was said by previous speakers here. Brexit is a very sad thing from the Finnish point of view, but I still personally think that if that is the outcome and result of a referendum in the UK, we need to live with that and create a close partnership with the UK in security and defense. But the worst thing would be to create a kind of rivalry and very negative atmosphere between the two parties. So let's try to avoid that. And finally, I must point out that after Andrew's presentation, that it was still the US president that questioned NATO's Article 5 by referring to, for the first time in NATO's history, to the cost to the military budgets and coupling together the credibility of Article 5 and the financial contributions of the member states. So that's what has weakened NATO, not efforts to construct European defense. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Thea. I think I will open for questions from the audience now, because we have just 20 minutes left. Please give me a signal and you will be provided with a microphone. Really? Okay. Do we have a microphone?
Yes.
Franke from the European Council on Foreign Relations. I have a comment for Andrew and a question for Julian.
Yeah.
So Andrew, I hear what you're saying on the transatlantic relationship, but it so reminds me of the NATO summit. And I know that a few of colleagues here were there because we were at the NATO Engages conference on the side of the NATO summit, and we had these two US senators there that spoke at length about the ironclad commitment of the US to NATO. And while they were talking, everyone got push messages on their phones saying Donald Trump is threatening to withdraw from NATO if NATO doesn't pay up. So I'm sorry to say, but at this point, I really don't think that we can fully trust the US anymore on this. And it's not just Donald Trump. I mean, number one, it's Donald Trump, and he may get the second term, which kind of prolongs the problem. Number two, it's also what Barbara called an anomaly, which again is a normative statement, but I think we can all agree that no one would create or design NATO, and especially NATO burden sharing as it stands today, if it was being designed today. I mean, the way that burden sharing works within NATO is a historical legacy, and it is an anomaly, and it will need to rebalance, and I think everyone should be aware of that. And then the third reason why I also think that we really have a problem here is that when you look at the polls, you can see that the bipartisan consensus on NATO in the US really is breaking. I mean, yes, the Democrats are still very much behind it, but you now have more than half of Republicans that basically say allies' views shouldn't even be taken into consideration according to the last Pew poll. So, I don't think you can blame. I don't really think you can blame the Europeans for thinking about autonomy, which, as was explained early on, isn't really about attention. But looking at the deeds, at the US deeds, for me just doesn't really cut it anymore. And then for Julian, I was a bit surprised by your criticism of PESCO, or rather, I would like to hear more about your criticism of PESCO, because you seem to dismiss it as just another acronym. But for me, I mean, you were very much focused on capabilities, and for me, PESCO is one way to potentially deliver capabilities. Has it delivered yet? No, of course not. It's only 1 year old. It's actually today. It's PESCO's anniversary. But I would very much like to hear why you don't think that PESCO could actually deliver the capabilities you're looking for.
Okay, I think you bring in the Anglo-American side here. Please, Andrew.
Thank you for your question, and I didn't mean to be flippant when I said so it's all our fault. Look, this is my third tour in Europe, and I don't want to make light of it, but I have increasingly sensed that in too many conversations in Europe, the issues of transatlantic security cooperation are reduced to President Trump. I would even venture that to some extent it becomes almost a way to close any conversation with us. President Trump said X, President Trump said this, he didn't say that, he didn't say this in a timely fashion. Showing my age here, 2010, NATO New Strategic Concept, I'm at NDU, Secretary Gates is speaking to the Europeans in the audience. And in 2010, he says only 5 member states of NATO are meeting the 2% target on defense spending. And if the Europeans don't resource defense, then the strategic concept will be largely not worth the paper it's written on. Secretary Ash Carter, the same thing. So I keep asking myself why all of a sudden when my president comes in and says, we need to spend more, and he's from Queens, I believe, and maybe doesn't sound as polished as we're used to in our conversations, but he's a real estate developer from New York. You have to have elbows to function in that environment. And it says things that I personally probably would not have said in the same fashion, which doesn't change the fact that where the Europeans are in terms of their military spending and military capabilities, whether it's 2%, 1%, 3%, 5%, this is really a political question. The alliance has undertaken, right, voluntarily as a sovereign group of states, the obligation to get to the 2% level, and it's been repeated at 3 summits already. And I'm not making light of your concerns, but I really always ask our European friends to look at what we do and don't just listen only to what people say or leaders say or what's said in debates. about the growing fatigue at the popular level, and quite frankly, the lack of even basic familiarity with what NATO is in the United States. I remember when Ivo Dalder was our rep, he wanted to have a summit in Chicago because he kept saying we need to bring this notion of NATO to the heartland. I'm struck that when my European colleagues travel to the US, they basically travel to either the Eastern Corridor or Western Corridor, right? And hardly ever connect with what sometimes arrogantly is described in Washington as the flyover country, which is most of my country, right? So the discussion about the future of U.S. commitment to Europe, which I will argue remains unshakable at the elite level, at the policy level, and I quite frankly believe that the American public supports it in a kind of almost visceral way, instinctive way. But that needs to be reciprocated from your side. And I just thought of something, last comment I want to make. How about instead of talking about strategic autonomy, we start talking about strategic capability for Europe, which allows you to do a lot of things, but does not send a message to my country that you're somehow trying to emancipate yourself from something that somehow implicitly is difficult, uncomfortable, or oppressive. Maybe that could change the conversation.
Thank you, Andrew. And Julian, we have a lot of questions,
Okay,
so
I'll
please
make
be
this
short.
very quick. I mean, my critique of PESCO is threefold. One is experience. San Marlo, headline goal, Helsinki Declaration, ESTP, PESCO 1 with Lisbon, battle groups. We've gone round and round this particular circle. And in terms of defence outcomes, it has produced very little in relation to what the threat that is emerging. Second, you look at this GGAP IIIS report. Without the Brits, even with PESCO and the 17 different project areas, there are 5 scenarios identified, only 2 could be completed at the more permissive end of the scale. There is nothing in PESCO that's really preparing Europeans for a high-end warfighting role of any sustaining capability. So it's simply not realistic in terms of the environment. And 3, military power is relative. If you look at the new look Russian military modernization, China's modernization with double-digit increase every year since 1989, the US 750 billion, which will include a big artificial intelligence modernization leap, will place real pressure on interoperability. None of the PESCO projects are getting anywhere near that level of complexity or capability. And that's why, to me, they're primarily political instruments rather than military.
Okay. Do you want to respond to this, or should we just open up for more questions? I will collect some. We have one gentleman there. You will be provided with a microphone. 2 microphones.
Thank you. Frank Petrarch, former State Secretary for Foreign Affairs in Sweden. I would like the panel to share with us your comments and views on the issue of NATO enlargement. The prospects, the political feasibility, the security aspects, in short, the pros and the cons. And the background to my question is, of course, the debate going on in Sweden and Finland, admittedly a low-intensity debate, but still, with regard to that particular issue. To simplify, those who are in favor of Swedish and Finnish NATO membership would argue that it's high time to increase the threshold for conflicts in the Baltic regions and increase the deterrent aspect. Those who are against, again to simplify, say, well, this would be seen as a dangerous provocation by Russia, this would erode stability, and therefore it would be counterproductive. Over to the panel.
Okay, thank you. And we have a lady behind there, non. Yeah, thank you.
My name is Julian Michta. I am from World Forum, and my question is for the future. How are the United States disposed to assist cyber warfare in Europe on AI, on RMG, etc.? Will you share with all the European states States, or will you pick up? Will you pick just some of your allies, traditional ones, particularly the UK? And now that the UK leaves the EU, will the UK suffice for your needs in Europe? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Do we have another question? No. So back to the panel. Could you start from the other side, yeah? Please tell. NATO enlargement and US assistance on or sharing with regard to cyber.
Of course, I can only from the Finnish point of view comment on the first question, and Frank Verbrage knows that I was among the 4 authors of the Finnish so-called NATO study 2 years ago, where we assessed the implications of address the possible implications of Finland's NATO membership. And to address your question, in that report we concluded that without making a value judgment of the conclusion, we concluded that Finland and Sweden joining NATO would change, would have a strategic, lead to a strategic change in this region, but we did not make a value judgment, as we were not asked to assess if it's good or bad, just assess the or study the implications. But perhaps from the NATO's point of view, a value judgment of this can be made, whether it's a good or bad change. Thank you.
So my take on the NATO enlargement, so in a few months, the Baltic states will celebrate the 15th anniversary of being members of NATO, so quite a while already. And you mentioned, let's say, Russia's arguments about provocation, so they were also prevalent then. Because Russia, thought this is a provocation. And then it's, we use the term enlargement, they use the term expansion. So two different terms with different connotations. But when it comes to Sweden and Finland, then definitely the Baltic states are interested that both of the countries are militarily, not only militarily strong. We know that Finland is absolutely capable, but Sweden probably still is the weakest link, and I think that for the Baltic states it does not matter that much are you part of the alliance or not, but Sweden is definitely seen as a very important partner, which helped establish the military forces assisted, especially for Latvia in the 90s, so that Sweden was stronger and capable of assisting us if there was a necessity. But when it comes to enlargement in broader terms, NATO is also not made of a rubber. So and now we're almost at 30. So how far can we go? And this is again an issue for future.
Please, Julian, NATO enlargement.
Yeah, I'll be NATO enlargement and cyber. So there are two kind of partners that NATO has. One is stability partners, and that is more in the Middle East, helping with things like security sector reform. The other are strategic partners, and Sweden is one of those. The key issues for Sweden with enlargement would be interoperability of Swedish forces with NATO standards, fourth generation techniques, command and control. Now, given Sweden's already close partnerships, it would not take much to ensure that Sweden was very much inside that umbrella for all the conventional aspects of NATO forces. The political side of that, if Sweden ever did wish to be a member and NATO accepted it as a member, I can't imagine that would cause too many complications for a country like Sweden. The second question on cyber artificial intelligence and sharing, that's a very specific question. I wrote a paper last year with General Breedlove and Admiral Zambellis and General Allen called Future War NATO, in which we laid out a vision of all of this, how this stuff would be used in warfare and its role within the framework of the alliance. The essential point is that much of this work is being undertaken by the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency in the US, DARPA. In the big adaptation report that I wrote with Sandy Vershbauer and Gianpaolo Di Paola and others last year, we called for a NATO Advanced Research Project Agency that would work closely with ACT, linked into DARPA, because the future of warfare is about the acceleration of speed in decision-making and weaponry. Those are the things that are going to happen, and specifically whether it's cyber or AI, which are all part of this package of disruption and engagement. With AI, our adversaries are working towards a situation where machine learning would drive decision-making in combat, which would almost accelerate it beyond a commander's choice. This is really quite delicate and dangerous stuff we're moving into. The Americans are doing excellent work on that. Yesterday, the RAF fired its first 4 Mach hypersonic missile. So the UK is working closely with the US in this area because we understand the vital importance of maintaining interoperability at the high end of the military envelope as a fundamental down payment on the backbone of alliance in the 21st century.
Thank you. Andrew?
I think Julian has pretty much answered the question. I would just add one more thing, sir. I think we have allowed the idea of NATO enlargement to kind of grind to a halt in 2008. I personally think what NATO enlargement achieved in political terms, transforming the entire gray zone of post-Soviet Europe into what is now a very vibrant and successful community, is a great unequivocal success. And we used to debate at that time, should we have just 1 round, 2 rounds, 3 rounds. In 2008, I mean, it was not just that the Russians invaded Georgia, they also the Eucharist summit. We couldn't get the map for Ukraine, we couldn't get the map for Georgia, and we couldn't even get the Greeks to talk to the Macedonians at that time. And I would argue that that was the point, even before Ukraine, when NATO enlargement in effect halted, and the whole west to east momentum that we had in terms of transforming the entire space, then began to feel the back pressure from the Russians. 2014 is when the momentum is being reversed, and Russia is now contesting action in the area that we thought was incorporated. So there's a long introduction to simply say, I agree with Julian that if you made a decision in Sweden, or in Finland, or in any, to join the alliance, the process would be, I think, non-controversial for the large part. It would be seamless. The real arguments over enlargement are going to be, can the Ukrainians actually get to the point where they can be considered? And here the Russians have all but ensured that that conversation will never take place because you cannot vote yourself into going to war, effectively. Because by controlling Donetsk and Luhansk, you have an ongoing hot shooting war, and that would require the alliance, which works in consensus, to in effect declare itself going to war with Russia. And I think that's where the Russians have a tremendous lever on the eastern flank. But in the northern flank, if your country or the Finns, or in my view, were to decide to join the alliance, then I think this would be a pretty relatively seamless process in my system.
Would it be good for the security in Northern Europe?
Yes.
Yes.
Today is a strategic hope.
I raised my case.
You participated in Triton Junction with 2,400 soldiers, didn't you? Exercising, and you are cooperating very well in the northern region. Anna, the last question.
Thank you very much. Yes, perhaps I might steal a couple of minutes from the coffee break. That's perhaps my prerogative as an organizer. I quite insist, posing 2 questions. One to Andrew. Since there is a nuance between my transatlanticists here, capabilities, and you say logistics. Andrew, do you agree with the risk of overstretch that Julian has pointed out for the US? Because that would affect Northern Europe pretty severely. So a comment on that, please. And Thea, you described very well the political alliance that the EU is and brings, and what that has for security implications. However, if the EU would develop into a military alliance, how would that be perceived in Finland?
Could I also add, Māris, that your state secretary said that the comprehensive nature of the threat is important. It's also a war about psychology. Maybe you could comment on that. Thank you. So, yeah, we start there with him.
I think if it would happen, that something happened today, I don't see in any other circumstances the EU would develop into a military alliance than if something would happen to NATO. The Finns, for the time being, as also was said about the Swedes here this morning, are highly supportive of the EU membership. So they are much more supportive of their EU membership today than before the Ukraine crisis. That's a fact. And the policy field within integration that is the most popular one is the common security and defense policy. People are not in opinion polls when asked. They give their support to a military alliance with Sweden and within the EU framework. So the starting point would be quite good, but of course this is only based on an opinion poll in today's conditions, where such a defense alliance in the EU's framework is very distant. But it should be added, though, that when President Macron and Chancellor Merkel made their statements recently about a possible European army, those ideas were commented on by the Finnish President Sauli Niinistö with the following remark: "It sounds like a good idea." So I leave you with these atmospheres from Finland. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Māris?
Yes, on the psychological defense, as the Latvian representative earlier mentioned, that Latvia is going to approve the comprehensive defense strategy. In my view, it's the same total defense. It is, and they define it as the ability for the society to resist from external and internal pressures. And in that sense, Latvia is quite, different, at least from Sweden and many other countries. As I mentioned earlier in my intervention, that quite a significant number of people live in the Russian information space. So we are, naturally inclined to, hostile influences. But apart from that, in Latvia we have one of the lowest willingness to defend the country in the region. So in Finland, ranks usually, very high. Some 80% on Latvia, it's something like 2 times smaller, the numbers. So there are still many issues, why people do not believe in the country. In the government, the government is very unpopular, so currently we do not have a government. It's technical and similar issues as in Sweden, so you're 1 month here ahead of us. But there are also many other issues. So Latvia remains the only country in the region without conscription. So Latvian officials are quite, so to say, stubbornly holding to their view that it's enough with 6,000 approximately professional soldiers and then reserve. But that's also quite a significant issue, because you need, still some kind of manpower that can support the frontline forces if necessary. So that is something that also our authorities hopefully will consider in future.
Sorry, we didn't have enough time to speak about internal challenges, but Julian, keep on.
Only very briefly, I would plead that I think there's a need for definition and precision in the discussion about a European army. I think the mistake that President Macron made perhaps was to confuse what he meant. He meant a European force. Now, if you go back to something like the European Rapid Reaction Force of 1990, agreed at the Helsinki Declaration of a 60,000 strong rapid reaction force. That strikes me as a force that could really be quite usable, both under several flags. There is a reason why it would be good for the EU to have a force that is usable, because there are places around Europe where I wouldn't want to put a force flagged by a NATO or a US or a UK force, where an EU force would communicate a different political identity in complexity. So there are good reasons to have such a force, but it must be a joint force built on that model. If you want to look at what a European army would look like, go back to the European Defence Community of 1952 to 1954, and there you will see what it would look like. And it's very clear, you will not have a European army until you have a European government. And good luck with that.
Okay.
Last, very quickly, I will surprise you, maybe not. To me, it's not an either or. I'm saying this isn't trivial for the military officers in this room, but non-deployable capabilities are not usable capabilities. So logistics that are not in place, you cannot deploy, you cannot exercise, you don't really have usable capabilities. That's why when I said logistics, it didn't mean capabilities. That has to be done jointly, and we cannot be in a situation, especially if you want to deter and exercise. If you do a saber strike, right, we're exercising the Baltics, and it takes you 2 weeks to get our assets to that position. From the Russian perspective, that sends a very clear message. It doesn't mean that in a crisis we cannot offload, charge across the territory and do what we need to do. But that is not the way that you exercise to build a level of deterrence and confidence that you do in the system. And that's why I keep saying, legal issues, infrastructure issues, the role of the private sector, transport. Look at all the lessons we had in the Cold War, where and remember, we used to have reforger, right? The return of forces to Germany. Whereas we for both, we need to build up the logistical infrastructure to the point that we can credibly exercise this on a regular basis.
Thank you very much. Help me to give them a big applause.